Hello, and welcome to History 113, the political history of the Philippines. My name is Jariah Gray, or you can call me Jai, and I'm really excited to be here with you this semester because we're going to be having our pilot for face to face classes, which we're going to talk about later, like how it's going to work for History 113. And also because I think the political history of the Philippines is an area that's often taken for granted in the sense where we don't typically get to define what a political history is and how it can be a very important tool to understanding the history of power relations in the Philippines. No? So, here in this particular lecture, we're going to do a course overview, right? And in our course overview, we're going to do the following things. We're going to try to explain the course approach to political history and its dilemmas. We're going to try to survey the overview of the syllabus with a focus on the basic course structure, the topics to be covered, requirements to be given, as well as the grading scheme. And finally, we're going to try to identify the method of learning to be employed this semester. Okay, so because this is your first encounter with one of my class materials, I want you to know that when you get a set of slides like this, they're actually interactive. Assuming they haven't been like condensed and flattened. But generally, you can navigate between each section like this, right? And at the end of the presentation, you also have a quick summary navigation to help you remember everything we've studied so far. Okay. So let's go back to our introduction here now. The most important thing you need to know right away is that we're following blended model 2, meaning we're going to have a combination of limited face-to-face classes with online synchronous and asynchronous sessions. So we're going to have 4 limited face-to-face sessions between October 19 and October 30, which you can find in our class schedule on our VLE page. And for the rest of the semester, we're going to be doing online sync async sessions, mostly because I found in the past years that the most important material that my students have really appreciated and they've learned from are recorded video lectures, such as this one. So we're going to be using a blend of all of these in order for us to both learn about political history and to apply the skills we're picking up here and there. Okay, so why are we having only 4 face-to-face sessions? We're going to do something called learning laboratory, where we have a workshop type situation where we're gonna have a very interesting topic one I'm excited about, which is the history of Philippine sultanates. So you're gonna be learning about them, breaking down readings together in groups. We're going to be looking at how we can apply this kind of information to research questions as well as conversations in the general public. And then to cap it all off, we're going to have a brief report from each working group to see how you are able to process historical materials and how you're able to articulate historical arguments. And so really excited for that. No? Okay, having said that, for today, I'm trying to introduce a couple of concepts, not in a very deep way, just in a way where you're familiar with them, and you know that throughout the semester we're going to be trying to define what these are. No. So here are the terms. Just have a quick definition on hand for old political history, new political history, Philippine political history, the political systems approach, the politics of nation state, as well as the politics of power relations. Okay, so let's get to it. How are we going to discuss our course overview now? Ay, hindi ko pala binasa yung outline, no? So, module 0 dapat yan, hindi module 1. So, firstly, kailangan muna natin i-introduce, di ba? Bakit nga ba natin kailangang aralin yung political history of the Philippines? And then, we're gonna try to define what political history is. And then we're gonna look at the coverage of topics for this semester. And then we're gonna cap it off with an overview of our course approach and requirements, plus grading system. So, let's move on to the first part of our discussion here. What exactly is the role of political history in the Philippines? In order to answer that, we have another question that we want to think about first. Why do we need to study Philippine political history, which is History 113, given that we've already studied History 1, diba? So let's look at it muna. No? Let's think about history 1. What would the general uses of Philippine history be outside the classroom? So I've kind of reflected upon my own experiences and come up with this kind of way of looking at the uses of history. The first thing you have to do is identify the audience. So who is listening to the history? What are the uses of the history for them? And how do you know that this is a real life thing? Like it's a real life example rather than something I'm just making up, diba? So let's start with the first audience. We know that history has value outside the classroom for the general public. Because, on one hand, histories are important repositories for forming national identity, whether this history is something they learn about through the classroom setting or a commemorative lecture that they go to in Luneta, diba? Or if it's something that they learn about from a vlogger, it doesn't really matter where they pick up that history. If they believe it to be true, they're going to integrate it as part of their own national identity, especially because we are citizens of the Philippines and we can't escape the political value of our past. So besides, individual uh, national identity, we also tend to use historical information for the political implications that they have. For instance, in the recent elections, we know that history was an important set of narratives, even if the history may have come from different sectors. Diba? The fascinating thing for me is that people of different walks of life suddenly had an opinion on a subject that most of the time is considered quite boring to the general public. And yet, sobrang init ng topics related to martial law and Aquino legacy in the Philippines, and people really wanted to weigh in on that. And to an extent, our perceptions of history affected our political vote, di ba? So that's an interesting thing, and we know that history has value in this way. We also know that history has value for political figures. So that's the other side of the coin. Because history matters to us, no matter what our level of historical literacy is, there's going to be a little bit of value to historical analysis or historical fact. At dahil alam yun ng mga political figures, ginagamit nila ang kasaysayan para sa politicking o pamumulitika, di ba? So ang pamumulitika can come in the form of propaganda, and it can come in the form of many different narratives. But at the end of the day, the way political figures frame history and how successfully they're able to do that can affect the way we live in our everyday lives, from the level of who we're going to vote into power to who they're going to support and who they're going to say is the rightful leader, and to the kinds of policies that they're going to change in our educational system with regards to historical knowledge, diba? So on another level, we also have the audience of policymakers. There's definitely an overlap between political figures and policymakers, but you can think about it this way. There are certain policies in the Philippines that require a deep amount of historical information. For instance, policies such as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, which was passed in 1997 and hopes to protect the rights and lands of Philippine IPs, diba? Had to have a lot of debates on what the value of IP's history is in the Philippines. Imagine niyo yun. An indigenous person by law is defined as someone who has an attachment to an ancestral domain and who has an attachment to a cultural and historical heritage where they, for a long period of time, were uncolonized and could develop their own cultures as separate from what the rest of the Philippines was experiencing under Spain, for instance, diba? That's a historical argument that now supports a real-life act with real-life consequences, like who is going to get jurisdiction to develop certain parcels of land in the Philippines. We see this in the Cordilleras. Who is going to have certain privileges, such as scholarship programs and other special rights or special privileges that are given to the descendants of indigenous people, diba? Another concrete example where policymakers have to be aware of history is in the recent creation of the BARM, or the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, um, where there's a long history of Moro struggle related to very real, very tangible wars on the ground happening in areas like Zamboanga and other parts of southwestern Mindanao, diba? So there's a concrete history there that now supports the creation of an autonomous region in the Philippines with beefed up laws, diba? So we'll see how that goes in the future. Pero may value talaga yung history in that way. And you can see here, it's not just history, it's political history that has value. And on the other level, of course, for us as students of history, enrolled in a history program where we have a structured kind of set of subjects that tell us what the area of history is all about, our participation in political history is a way to learn about and contribute to historical knowledge, diba? So because it's part of our curriculum, we have an extra incentive to be aware of the conceptual handles and debates that surround political history, as well as the details of our past which fall into political history. Okay, so ganda no. Although there are different kinds of history, social history, economic history, and all of them are important, when we think about ourselves as citizens of the Philippines that have to participate in political affairs like elections or historical conversations on ethical topics, diba? We find that political history has a very distinct set of contributions for our historical literacy as well as our academic training. So let's look at historical literacy first. Here are the assumptions. There's actually a set of knowledge and tools to equip Philippine citizens so we can make smarter choices when there are historical claims being presented to us, right? And then we know that Philippine history is inherently political because it has a way of swaying political opinion. And we know that there's continuing value of history in public discourse, as we saw in the recent elections. So, what can we do in order to contribute, or even if not contribute, what can we do in order to survive, diba? Given our climate? How do we become autonomous critical thinkers? We're still able to maybe inform other people when they want to listen to us. The answer from the perspective of this course is to learn about political history. By learning the details of the historical past, as well as the ways to analyze our historical narratives for their political implications, we're able to make our own smarter decisions with regards to historical claims, and we're able to articulate these concepts and histories for other people as well, diba? You can't really articulate something you don't understand. And I see this a lot in the general public. There are people who they have good intentions, especially with the whole, let me educate you kind of trajectory to campaigning in the past election. It comes from a really good place. But once you start breaking down the arguments that are being presented, there's actually a lack of in-depth analysis sometimes that makes it difficult for the people who were explaining those perspectives to translate their language in a way that's more accessible to other people. So hopefully our experiences in this course will increase our historical literacy, both on the level of knowledge and on the level of explanation. Diba? Okay. Now the other thing that's important for us, because we are history majors, is our academic training. Now here are the assumptions now. There are conceptual handles that you need to learn about. For instance, what is political history? And why is it problematic for other historians? For instance, in UP Diliman, under their BA History program, they don't actually have a subject called political history. They have social history, cultural history, economic history. But in their curriculum, nawawala yung political history. Why is that, diba? While we in UP Baguio continue to have that subject. We're going to talk about that later. There's a problem underlying political history, which we've tried to answer through our curriculum. Now, another thing is, as potential scholars, future academics, we have to have insights into the questions being asked in the field. What does that mean? Imagine this, right? You're trying to write a paper about the Hook Rebellion, or okay, something more accessible. You're trying to write a paper about the Philippine Revolution, right? And you find this really great paper. Like, you found it on ResearchGate, you download it because it's a free, diba? It's a free paper, and you're reading it, but you actually have no idea if the arguments being made in this paper are, one, supported by the general scientific community of historians, and two, if these arguments are still the ones being forwarded today. Kunyari, paano kung yung article na yun ay from the 1970s and yung ibang claims na yun ay na-debunk na, or taken for granted na yung claims na yun, and we're moving on to other questions. For instance, in the case of the Philippine Revolution, one of the more recent questions being asked by scholars such as Nicole Kuinjiang Aboitis is, how do we connect the Philippine Revolution to other Asian revolutions? Diba? It's a different perspective. And we call that transnational history. So often our articles and papers that we find online tend to be national histories. No? Well, we'll learn more about that later, especially when we get into the history of the revolution and the history of national versus local history and transnational history. But for us now, the point is simply to know what scholars have typically argued on, what are the dominant debates, so that when you start writing your papers, you're plugged into that, diba? And you're more or less familiar with what could count as a important paper when you begin writing. So this is a gateway into potential research interests. Now, in addition to that, if you're not really going to be an academic, and that's okay, because many people don't actually end up writing historical papers, diba? One other value of this form of academic training for us is to apply specific historiographic perspectives and themes to Philippine history. Let's give you an example now. Here are 5 different strands of Philippine history, right? And some of them might sound familiar to you, some of them might not be super familiar yet. But think about it. Let's read it. You have Ilustrado Filipino proto-histories, official or state-sponsored histories, nationalist histories, third space histories, colonial histories. All of this is going to be discussed in Module 2. But they're basically themes that have been applied in answering the question, how has history been used in the Philippines as a political tool or a political topic? Parang ganun. So, we'll talk about that more later, no? Pero yun yung point. If you don't know what these mean yet, by going through the course, you'll have a deeper understanding of how we can understand, you'll have a deeper understanding of how to analyze history through historiographic perspectives, right? And if you don't remember what historiographic perspectives are, these are the parang schools of thought or perspectives by historical scholars in interpreting the historical past.